Hi everyone, welcome to Design Upgrade and thank you so much for tuning in. Just wanted to inform you that this video lesson is part of a larger online course which actually itself is one of many other courses that you can find on our main site courses.design-upgrade.com. Hope to see you soon there, and now please enjoy the video and also leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you like the content.
To open Grasshopper, first we need to start the program Rhino. And once we are in Rhino, to launch Grasshopper, we can either click on this button here, Launch Grasshopper, or we can just type Grasshopper in the command bar. Like that. So this window is now Grasshopper, and we can move it around like that, or we can also minimize and maximize it. So basically, Rhino is a program for 3D modeling, and Grasshopper is a visual programming environment that we can use to design our algorithms to automate different tasks in Rhino. Let's start by taking a look into the Grasshopper interface. On the top, we have our menu bar, which is very similar to other Windows applications. And we'll take a look in more detail to some of these view and display options later on. Then we have our component panels, in which we can find our Grasshopper components grouped by categories. So let me show you how this works. We can, for instance, create a new document here. So you can see that the last open files have disappeared, and we can click on a Grasshopper component and we can drag it into the canvas like that. So this workplace is the canvas, and here we can combine our Grasshopper components to define our algorithms or Grasshopper definitions. So this is basically where the action takes place. Then we have the canvas toolbar, in which we can find some of the most used Grasshopper commands here. And we also have these preview options that you can find also in the display menu, and we are going to see them in more detail later on. And finally, if you go to the lower part of the screen, you can see the status toolbar, in which we can see, for instance, now what was the last time that we saved our file. In order to explain Grasshopper components, first we need to differentiate between components and parameters. We find the parameters under the parameter tab right here. So let's just grab the point parameter, and we can differentiate the parameters because the icon is basically a black hexagon with a symbol in the middle. And you can see that they have just one input and one output. So in order to store parameters here, a very common way to do it is by referencing geometry from Rhino. So let's get back to Rhino for 1 second, and we are going to draw a point here, like that. And what we can do now is, of course, reference this point from Grasshopper using our container. And by the way, if you want to navigate through the Grasshopper canvas, you can click and drag the right mouse button, and you can find your Grasshopper components in this way. So now this is our container or parameter, and what we are going to do is to right click on this left side of our parameter, and we can choose set one point because we are going to reference just one Rhino object. So we can select our point, and now we can see that it has like a red cross, which means that we are referencing it from Grasshopper. And if we select this point in Rhino, you can see that this gamble appears, and we can move the point around, but it doesn't matter how far we move it. It's still being referenced from Grasshopper. So these are our parameters, and now let's get a component. For instance, we are going to get the line component, which we can find on the curve tab here under primitive, this one, the line component. So the components, what they do is they perform a particular action. In this case, this is the line component, which is going to create a line from two input parameters. And now we can see that this component has several input parameters and one output parameter. So let's define another point in Rhino, as we did before. And we are going to reference it with another point container. And by the way, you can also do double click into the Grasshopper canvas and you can select our components and parameters this way as well. So let's do right click here, let's select the point, like that, and now we're going to connect our parameters with this line component here. So for that, we're going to click and drag in this from this output parameter to this input parameter of our line component. And we do the same with the other point. And now you can see that this line has appeared in Rhino. So this component is actually doing, what it is doing is creating a line between these 2 points. And we can change the input parameters in this case by moving the points around, and we can see that Grasshopper automatically updates the Grasshopper definition. You can see how this line keeps updating this particular geometry. Now you are starting to understand how this visual programming environment of Grasshopper works. So we create our algorithms or Grasshopper definitions by just combining several Grasshopper components. And of course, we can select them and move them around, and we can also copy and paste them with the usual Windows commands, and so on and so forth. And now you can see that we are displaying the component icons, but for instance, we can come to these display options here, and we can choose where we want to display the icons or the names of our components. Or if we want to display the full name of our parameters or just the initial letter. But let's leave it like it was. And another interesting option is that you can make right click into the components, and you have this help option right here, and you can click on it if you don't know how a particular component works. In this case, it's very simple and straightforward because it just creates a line between 2 points. And if you, for some reason, if you have some Grasshopper component and you don't know where you found it, you can click Ctrl Alt, and you can do left click on the component, and then Grasshopper shows you in which particular tab you found that Grasshopper component. And as you have seen, Grasshopper components can have several colors. A component with a light gray color is a component that works properly and has no warning or errors. An orange component is a component that has warnings. It's very common that they are missing some input parameter. If the component is in a dark gray color, it means that the output has been hidden. If the color is even darker, it means that the component has been disabled. And then, if the component has a green color, it means that we have just selected this component. And if the component turns red, it means that it is a component with an error. And even though we can see our geometry from Grasshopper in Rhino, we can't touch it or manipulate it within Rhino. But there is a way to actually transfer our Grasshopper geometry into Rhino, and that is to bake our geometry. So in order to bake, in this case, our line, we can do right click into our Grasshopper component, and we can click on bake. And we can choose the layer in Rhino in which we want to bake this object. In this case, it is the default layer. So now you can see that this line has turned black, and that means that it is now a Rhino object and it doesn't have anything to do with Grasshopper anymore. So we can move it around, manipulate it as any other normal Rhino object. And we can do actually the inverse process, because in this case we are referencing geometry from Rhino in Grasshopper, and imagine that we would like to have this geometry in Grasshopper but also independent from Rhino. So what we can do is to come here to our point parameter in this case, and we do right click in the input parameter, and we are going to say internalize data. So if we do that, we are going to internalize the data into this parameter that we were referencing from Rhino. So now in this case, you can see that I can move this, sorry, I've just internalized this other point. So now you can see that I can move this point around, but the line remains in this place because I have just internalized this point here. But let me undo this process with Ctrl C. And there are a couple of options that are interesting as well. So as we said before, we can hide Grasshopper objects in Rhino. So in this case, let's assume that we want to hide this line. So in order to do that, we do right click on the Grasshopper component once more, and we click in this preview button here. So we don't want to preview this Grasshopper object. So if we do that, we are not seeing our line anymore. And we click again, and we see the line again. And also you can use the keyboard shortcut Ctrl-Q. We select the component, we hit Ctrl-Q, and we hide and show the line again and again. And we can hide this object, but if we let the mouse here, we can see that the component is actually producing this output. So it's actually working, but we are just not seeing it into Rhino. But what we can also do is to completely disable this component. So if we do right click in the component once again, we can click on enabled. And now, as we saw before, the component has turned dark gray. And as you can see, there is no output from this component. So we have completely disabled this Grasshopper component. And we can do right click and hit enabled once again. And now you can see that our Grasshopper component is working again. And there is also a keyboard shortcut for enabling and disabling our Grasshopper components, which is Ctrl-E. So if we select our Grasshopper component and we hit Ctrl-E, you can see that we are disabling and enabling our Grasshopper component. So far, we have seen just one way of defining our input parameters for the Grasshopper components, and it is basically by referencing Rhino geometry into Grasshopper. And now we are going to see additional ways of defining our input parameters. And to do that, let me just get an additional component, which is going to be the divide curve component. So in order to find it, we are going to come to this curve category and to this division subcategory, and it is this component here, divide curve. So we are going to wrap it into our canvas, and let me put Grasshopper this way once again. And now, of course, if we click on the component or we leave the mouse here, we can see in the description that this component is going to divide a curve into equal length segments. And this component has three different input parameters. The first one is the curve parameter, which we are going to get from this other Grasshopper component. So, as you can see, we are connecting now the output of a Grasshopper component with the input of a new Grasshopper component. And this is basically how the workflow in Grasshopper looks like. We create our Grasshopper definition or our algorithms by just connecting Grasshopper components one after the other. So, as you can imagine, this Grasshopper definition is going to grow to the right side of our canvas. Okay, so this was our curve parameter, and now you can see that this component is actually dividing this curve, so you can see these points that it is generating into our Rhino viewport in this case. And let's take a look to the other input parameters. So we are going to ignore the kings by now, which is basically an option which allows us to split a segment in case that our input curve has some kings or sharp corners, let's say. But let's focus on this count parameter, and in this case we have to define the number of segments. And we can see that this component is expecting an integer parameter by the symbol that we are seeing in the top of the description, which is the integer parameter. So in order to specify the number of segments, we can do like before. We can do just right click into the input parameter, and we can manually set the integer number by just specifying it here. So before we referenced our Rhino geometry in the point parameter, and now we can also set numeric values by directly typing it into the Grasshopper component. Now we click on commit changes, and you can see that now this count parameter is now 4. And we can see that we have just 4 segments into our line in Grasshopper or in Rhino. But this is not very flexible yet, so let's define a way more powerful approach of defining our numeric input parameters. And this way is to use the Grasshopper sliders. So in order to find the sliders, we have to come back to our parameter tab here, and we are going to come to this input subcategory. And here we select the number slider. So we drop it into our canvas, and this is basically a Grasshopper slider. So this is a number slider, and we have this dot here, which we can click and drag to the sides, and you can see that we are automatically updating the value of this number slider. Okay, but this is now a real number with 3 decimal places, but what we are looking for is actually an integer number that we can plug into this Grasshopper component. So in order to change the numeric output of this slider, what we have to do is to make double click into the slider right here. So now this pop-up window appears, and in this upper part we can see that we can choose the type of number that the slider is creating. In this case, we are creating a floating point number with 3 decimal places, and as you can see, we can vary also the number of decimal places like that. But as we said, we are looking forward to an integer parameter, which is this option right here. So now we have an input parameter that goes between 0 and 1, like that. But of course, let's say that we want a wider range of output numbers, not just from 0 to 1. So in order to modify this numeric domain, we have to come here, and in this case, we are going to double click into the maximum number of this domain, and we are going to say, for instance, 20. So we accept the change, and now we can see that our numbers from this slider are going between 0 and 20. Perfect. And we also have these additional 2 options here, which allow us to create, for instance, even numbers. So now you can see that we are going from 8, 6, 4, and so on. Or we can also select to create just odd numbers, like 5, 7, 9, 11, and so on and so forth. But let's select again the integer number option, and let's get back into Grasshopper by hitting OK. And this is our modified slider, and you can see that now we are creating just integer numbers. So what we are going to do is basically to connect our slider with the count parameter from our Grasshopper component. And now you can see how these Grasshopper components are automatically updated, let's say. So now we have 9 segments in this Rhino viewport. And the great thing about the sliders is that we can modify them very easily, like that, by clicking and dragging this point, and the Grasshopper definition automatically updates. So as you can see, this is a very powerful resource. And there is another way of defining Grasshopper sliders, which is making double click into our canvas and just writing the numbers that we are looking for. So in this case, if we type like 0 and then 3 points and 12, now we are getting a slider that goes between 0 and 12. And this is probably faster than getting our slider from the component panels and modifying it in Grasshopper later on. And imagine that we were looking for real numbers as output from our slider, so we can just make double click again and select, for instance, 0.00 and then 3 points, and now 15, for instance, 0.00. So now it goes between 0 and 15. And we can even select let's say a default value. If we say, for instance, I don't know, 2, 3.5, so the default value is going to be 5, and then 3 points, and the maximum value, in this case, let's say 8. So the default value is 5, and it goes between 2 and 8. Just another way of defining our Grasshopper sliders. And let's focus on the output parameters now of this divide curve component. So if we leave the mouse over the output points, we can see that for the first time we are not getting a single item from the Grasshopper component, but we are getting a list, in this case a list of points. So what is a list? A list is basically a collection of items that have a particular data type. In this case, it is a point list. So we can notice that this is a list and not a single item. First, because we are seeing the 13 points in this panel, let's say. And also, if we take a look at the top, we also see that it is defined as points as list. So this kind of a list remark means that this component will produce a list of items. And in order to better visualize this list, we are going to get a Grasshopper panel. So let's get back to the parameter tab here, and we are going to choose a panel. So let's drop it into the Grasshopper canvas like that. And what we can do is to connect Grasshopper parameters with this panel, like that. So now let's expand our Grasshopper panel, and like that. And now you can see that we have our certain points inside of this panel, but more importantly, we realize that each point or each item of this list has an index attached to it. So this would be the point with index 0, this would be the one with index 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. So in this case, since we are dealing with a point list, there is another Grasshopper component that allows us to visualize this list in Rhino much better, in my opinion. So in order to get this component, we are going to come to this display category and then select the point list component. So we are getting this component here, and the first input parameter is our point list, and then we have to specify the size here of the numbers that we are going to display in Rhino. In this case, let's specify 0.5 with a slider as we just saw. So now this component is very interesting because what this is doing, this is basically displaying in Grasshopper the index of each point of our list. So now we can properly see which point has the index 0 attached to it, or index 4 or index 8, and so on and so forth. So let's maximize Grasshopper, and you can notice that the wire of this point list is not a single line anymore, but a double line. So there are three different kind of wires in Grasshopper. If we have a single line, it means that we are getting a simple item from the Grasshopper component. If it is a double line, it means that we are getting a list of items as output. And if it is a dashed line, it means that we are dealing with a tree structure. And we will see tree structures later on in this course. And now that our Grasshopper definition is starting to grow, let's see some ways in which we can keep this Grasshopper definition as clean as possible. So the first tool that we have at our disposal, let's say, is the align tool. So for instance, we can select these three input parameters, and we can click in these kind of arrows that we see here. So for instance, if we click in the left arrow, we can see how these three components or parameters are being automatically aligned to the left side. And another interesting option is to group components that do a similar action or have the same objective, let's say. In this case, what we can do with them is to select them, and then we do right click in the canvas and we select a group. So now these components are grouped together because we can see this rectangle in which they are included. And we can click on this rectangle and we can grab this component as a single unit. And this is our group, and we can just delete this group by just selecting this rectangle and clicking just delete. And finally, let's see another option. So I'm going to separate this a bit, and I'm going to get another point parameter for our output point. And now what we are going to see is clusters. So if we select these components in the middle and we do right click in the canvas, we can select cluster, and we can see that all these components have turned into a single Grasshopper component, but this is actually doing everything that we were doing before. So creating the line, dividing it, and so on and so forth. But we are not going to see this option in this course very much, so let's get back to our former Grasshopper definition. And this could be probably a good point for saving our Grasshopper definition. So in order to do that, we have to come to the file menu here and click on save or save as. So in this case, I'm just going to save it into the desktop with the name of Parametric structure. But it's very important that you notice that we are just saving the Grasshopper definition. So these components here. And if we are referencing some geometry from Rhino, as in this case that we are referencing these 2 points, we need to save the Rhino file as well. And that's what we are going to do right now. So we are going to save us into our desktop as a parametric structure as well. Parametric structure. So we see that we are usually going to deal with 2 different files, the Rhino file and the Grasshopper definition.